Congratulations. You are now the most useless lighthouse on the East Coast.
He just spent his last $500 on a pile of rocks.
Lawyer quietly whispered. He just spent his last $500 on a pile of rocks. The man who bought it never argued. He simply folded the deed, placed it carefully inside his worn leather folder, took his little daughter's hand, and walked out of the auction hall without looking back. No reporters followed him. No cameras cared, because everyone believed the same thing. The old lighthouse had been dead for nearly 20 years. Its light would never shine again. But exactly 8 months later, at 2:17 on a stormy Tuesday morning, every radar inside Atlantic Harbor suddenly failed. Satellite navigation disappeared. Communication towers went silent. The control room exploded into panic. More than 60 cargo ships, 3 Coast Guard vessels, and 1 passenger ferry carrying over 800 people were now sailing blindly toward dangerous underwater reefs. Engineers tried everything. Nothing worked. Then the oldest harbor captain slowly stood up. His trembling hand pointed toward the dark coastline. "There is still one light." The room became silent. The billionaire CEO frowned. "Impossible. I ordered that lighthouse demolished." The old captain slowly shook his head. "No. You sold it. And the man who bought it is now the only person alive who knows how to bring it back." The CEO felt her heartbeat stop, because for the first time in her career, a billion-dollar company, an entire harbor, and hundreds of innocent lives depended on the same quiet single father everyone had laughed at 8 months earlier. 8 months earlier, before anyone laughed, before anyone panicked, before anyone even remembered the lighthouse existed, Daniel Mercer was making blueberry pancakes for one very impatient little girl. "Dad!" 9-year-old Sophie Mercer stood in the kitchen wearing a bright yellow raincoat even though the sun was shining outside. "My pancakes are getting cold before they're even hot." Daniel laughed quietly. "I've never heard anyone complain about imaginary cold pancakes." She folded her arms. "I learned it from you." "Oh, you always complain before something happens." Daniel smiled. She wasn't wrong. Life had taught him to expect problems before they arrived. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. But being prepared had kept both of them alive after losing Sophie's mother 6 years earlier. Since then, their little white cottage overlooking the ocean had become their entire world. It wasn't large. The roof leaked during heavy rain. The porch leaned slightly toward the sea. The old pickup truck refused to start on cold mornings. But every evening, father and daughter watched the sunset from the cliff behind the house. Sophie called it our free vacation. Daniel never corrected her. Some of the best places in life really were free. At exactly 8:30 every morning, Daniel dropped Sophie at Harbor Elementary School. Every crossing guard knew them. Every teacher smiled when Sophie walked through the gates. Not because she was the loudest child. Quite the opposite. She noticed people others ignored. She remembered birthdays. She thanked bus drivers. She carried extra sandwiches because someone always forgot lunch. Daniel often wondered whether kindness could actually be inherited. If it could, she had inherited every bit of it from her mother. As Sophie disappeared into school, Daniel's phone vibrated. Unknown number. He ignored it. 10 seconds later, it rang again. Unknown number. Ignored. Then a voicemail notification appeared. He didn't listen. Instead, he started the old pickup and drove toward the coast. 20 minutes later, he parked beside a weather-beaten chain-link fence overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond the fence stood Mercer Point Lighthouse. Or at least, what remained of it. Broken windows, rust-covered iron stairs, cracked stone walls, seagulls nesting where the lantern room once glowed. Most people saw a ruin. Daniel stood silently for almost a full minute. Then he whispered something only the wind could hear. "I'm home." A security guard approached. "Morning." Daniel nodded politely. "You here for the auction?" "I am." The guard looked surprised. You actually planning to bid? Daniel smiled. Maybe. The guard laughed. You're the first person this month who's said that. Inside the temporary auction office, developers, lawyers, surveyors, investors, nearly 40 people filled the room. Large digital maps covered one wall. Harbor expansion plans covered another. At the center stood Eleanor Graves, 38 years old, founder and CEO of Graves Maritime Holdings. She had built one of America's fastest-growing shipping companies. People described her as brilliant, efficient, uncompromising. This morning, she intended to sell one useless lighthouse, then immediately approve construction of a new automated navigation system. To her, the lighthouse was simply an outdated obstacle. Nothing more. The auction began. Opening bid. $500. Silence. Nobody moved. The auctioneer smiled awkwardly. $500? Still nothing. Someone quietly joked. They'll have to pay us to take it. Scattered laughter filled the room. The auctioneer sighed. Any interest? A single hand slowly rose. Daniel Mercer. The room turned. Several investors smiled. One whispered, "He actually wants it." Another laughed. Probably thinks there's pirate treasure inside. Even Eleanor Graves looked up for the first time. Her eyes met Daniel's. She noticed the worn boots, the faded jacket, the old leather folder under his arm. Then she looked away almost immediately. $500. Going once. Going twice. Sold. The wooden hammer struck the table. Just like that, ownership of Mercer Point Lighthouse changed forever. As Daniel quietly signed the papers, Eleanor walked past him. Without stopping, she calmly said, "I hope you enjoy your collection of broken stones." Daniel looked up. "I think I will." She gave a polite smile. "I admire optimism." Then she continued walking. Neither of them realized that less than 30 feet beneath the lighthouse, hidden behind 60-year-old reinforced concrete, lay the original emergency navigation chamber, a system officially recorded as destroyed, but secretly never dismantled. And only one family had ever known how to operate it. The Mercer family. The laughter inside the auction hall didn't follow Daniel outside. The wind did. It carried the smell of salt and rain across the empty parking lot as Daniel folded the ownership papers and carefully placed them inside the same old leather folder his father had carried for almost 30 years. Sophie climbed into the pickup. "So," she fastened her seatbelt. "We own a lighthouse now?" Daniel smiled as he started the old engine. "We do." She looked out the window toward the distant tower standing alone above the cliffs. "Can we live there?" "Not yet." "Can we fix it?" "I hope so." She nodded confidently. "Then we'll fix it." Children had a remarkable way of treating impossible things like ordinary weekend projects. Daniel wished adults hadn't forgotten how. Across town, the atmosphere inside Graves Maritime headquarters was very different. A 40-story glass building overlooked the harbor. Every office window reflected hundreds of cargo cranes moving like giant steel animals along the waterfront. Inside the executive boardroom, Eleanor Graves stood before a digital map of the harbor expansion project. "This phase removes every obsolete coastal structure." She tapped the screen. The old lighthouse disappeared from the map. "In 12 months, the automated navigation grid will replace every manual system." Several board members nodded. One investor smiled. "Excellent decision. The maintenance savings alone will exceed $60 million over the next decade." Another executive added, "And will finally eliminate the legal liability attached to that lighthouse." Eleanor simply nodded. To everyone inside that room, the lighthouse was nothing more than an outdated expense. No one asked what it had once protected. Meanwhile, Daniel unlocked the rusted front gate. The hinges screamed after years without movement. Sophie covered her ears. "I think the gate just complained. It has every right to." Grass reached almost to their knees. Wildflowers had grown through broken stone pathways. Nature had slowly reclaimed everything people abandoned. Daniel looked toward the tower. The lantern room stood dark against the afternoon sky. His father used to say, "A lighthouse isn't alive because of electricity. It's alive because someone refuses to let darkness win." Daniel had been 14 when he first heard those words. He understood them much better now. Nearly 3 hours passed cleaning debris from the keeper's cottage. Broken furniture, collapsed shelves, rotten curtains, old newspapers dating back nearly 20 years. Sophie suddenly called from another room. "Dad, you need to see this." Daniel hurried inside. She pointed beneath a loose wooden floorboard. There was a box. It wasn't large. Just an old waterproof military-style metal case covered with dust. Its lock had rusted completely shut. Daniel carefully pried it open using a screwdriver. Inside, everything had been wrapped in thick oilcloth. A brass compass, several rolled blueprints, a weathered logbook, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, his father's handwriting remained perfectly clear. "For Daniel, only if the light ever belongs to us again." Daniel stopped breathing. Sophie looked up. "Grandpa knew we'd come back?" "I don't know." His hands moved more slowly than before, almost carefully, as though opening the envelope too quickly might somehow disturb the man who had written it. Inside rested a single folded page. Only one sentence. "Trust no map printed after October 1998. Nothing else. No explanation. No signature. Just those 7 words. Daniel frowned. What does that even mean? Before he could think further, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. Again. This time, he answered. A calm, elderly voice spoke first. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes. My name is Captain Henry Lawson." Daniel recognized the name instantly. Lawson had once supervised every harbor pilot entering the Atlantic Gateway. He had retired years ago. "I've been trying to reach you. How did you get this number?" "A friend at the auction." Silence followed. Then the old captain asked quietly, "Did Thomas leave you anything?" Daniel's eyes drifted toward the envelope. "Maybe." Captain Lawson's voice became even lower. "Then listen carefully. Do not show those papers to anyone, especially Graves Maritime." Daniel's expression hardened. "Why?" The old captain hesitated several seconds. When he finally answered, his voice carried something Daniel had never heard before. "Fear. Because if Eleanor Graves discovers what your father protected, she'll realize she accidentally sold you the most valuable piece of coastline in America." Daniel looked slowly toward the dark lighthouse standing against the sea. For the first time, he no longer saw an abandoned building. He saw a secret that powerful people were still trying to hide. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The phone remained pressed against his ear as he stared at the lighthouse. Finally, he asked quietly, "What exactly did my father protect?" Captain Lawson sighed. "I can't explain over the phone." "Then come here." "I can't." "Why not?" Another long silence. Then the old captain answered with painful honesty. "Because if anyone sees me visiting that lighthouse, people will start asking questions that some very powerful men have spent 20 years making sure nobody asks." The call ended. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. Sophie was watching him from the doorway. Was Grandpa's friend scared? Daniel forced a small smile. "A little." "Should we be scared too?" He looked toward the sea. "No, but we should be careful." The following morning, Daniel returned alone. Sophie was at school. Heavy clouds covered the coastline. He carried the blueprints, the old compass, and his father's notebook. The inside of the lighthouse was colder than he remembered. Every metal step groaned beneath his boots. The higher he climbed, the stronger the wind became. Finally, he reached the lantern room. Broken glass covered the floor. Rust covered the massive rotating lens. Dust hid everything beneath years of neglect. Most people would have seen nothing worth saving. Daniel noticed something different. Someone had cleaned one narrow strip of the floor. Recently. Not yesterday. Not last week. But certainly not 20 years ago. He slowly knelt beside it. Fresh boot prints. Large. Military-style soles. Only one set. Someone had been inside this lighthouse. Not long ago. His heartbeat slowed. Whenever something didn't make sense, his father had always repeated the same sentence. Never ask who benefits. Ask who needs everyone else to stay blind. Daniel stood. His eyes moved across the lantern room. Then, he saw it. One brass screw on the floor wasn't rusted. Every other fitting had turned dark brown over the years. This one still shined. He walked over carefully, removed his screwdriver, turned it once. Nothing. Twice. A faint metallic click echoed beneath the floor. The entire center platform shifted less than an inch. Daniel froze. Another hidden compartment. He pulled harder. The circular section slowly lifted. Beneath it, a narrow iron ladder disappeared into darkness. Cold air rushed upward. Air that had been trapped for years. Daniel switched on his flashlight. Concrete walls, steel pipes, old electrical cables, and something much larger below. His father's blueprints suddenly made sense. The lighthouse wasn't only a tower. It had always been two buildings. One above ground, one beneath it. At that exact moment, 30 miles away, Eleanor Graves was sitting inside the Harbor Expansion Command Center. Engineers surrounded massive digital screens. One young survey manager hurried inside. "Ma'am, we've confirmed yesterday's sonar scans." Eleanor didn't look up. "And the underground structures. What about them?" The manager hesitated. "They're still there." The room became unusually quiet. Chief Engineer Martin Shaw slowly removed his glasses. "That shouldn't be possible." The survey manager swallowed. "The old emergency tunnels were never demolished." Martin looked toward Eleanor. "If someone gains access, they'll discover the original navigation network." Another executive frowned. "I thought those records were destroyed." Martin answered quietly, "So did I." Eleanor finally looked away from her tablet. Her expression had changed. For 20 years. Who owned that lighthouse? The city. And now, the room fell silent. No one wanted to answer. Finally, the company lawyer spoke. "Daniel Mercer." Eleanor closed the file in front of her. "Find out everything about him. Family, employment, finances. I want a complete report before tonight." "Yes, ma'am." As everyone hurried from the room, Martin remained seated. He watched Eleanor for several seconds before speaking. "You're worried." She didn't deny it. "I sold land without inspecting it." Martin looked directly at her. "No. You sold history." Back beneath the lighthouse, Daniel climbed down the hidden ladder. Each step echoed through the darkness. The tunnel opened into an enormous underground chamber. His flashlight swept across thick concrete walls. Old generators, copper wiring, steel control panels. Everything was covered in dust, but not destroyed. Then his light stopped. Painted across the far wall, in large white letters, Unit 7, United States Coastal Emergency Navigation Network. Below it, his father's signature, Chief Systems Engineer. Daniel's breathing stopped. His father had never been only a lighthouse keeper. He had been the chief engineer responsible for one of the most important emergency navigation systems on the entire East Coast. And somehow, no history book, no government record, no newspaper had ever mentioned it. Daniel slowly opened the final blueprint. Across the bottom, his father's last handwritten note waited. "If you are reading this, Daniel, they finally let the world forget why this lighthouse was built. Now it's your turn to decide. Should the truth remain buried, or should the light shine one last time?" Daniel stared at the page. He had bought an abandoned lighthouse for $500. But hidden beneath it was a secret powerful enough to rewrite the history of an entire harbor. Daniel stood motionless beneath the underground chamber. The silence felt different down here. Not empty. Watched. He slowly swept his flashlight across the concrete floor again. That was when he noticed something impossible. Fresh footprints. Not one set. Two. One pair of heavy work boots. The other polished leather shoes. Neither belonged to him. Someone had entered this chamber recently. Someone who knew exactly where the hidden entrance was. Daniel's pulse quickened. His father had hidden this place for over 20 years. Who else knew? He followed the footprints toward the control room. Old electrical panels lined the walls, each labeled by hand. Emergency beacon, harbor signal relay, backup power grid. Everything was covered in dust, except one cabinet. Its door hung slightly open. Daniel stepped closer. The lock had been forced. Inside, there was only an empty mounting bracket. Whatever had been stored there was gone. His father's notebook suddenly slipped from beneath his arm. A folded page fell onto the floor. Daniel picked it up. Across the top, Thomas Mercer had written years earlier, "Without the crystal lens regulator, the emergency light can never operate." Daniel stared at the empty cabinet. The missing equipment wasn't random. Someone had stolen the one component capable of bringing the lighthouse back to life. Whoever had taken it understood exactly what this place was. Across town, inside Graves' maritime headquarters, a confidential meeting had already begun. Only 4 people sat around the long conference table. CO Eleanor Graves, Chief Engineer Martin Shaw, Company Lawyer Rebecca Ellis, and an elderly man Daniel had never met. His name was Samuel Pierce, former director of the Harbor Authority, retired 18 years earlier. Samuel slowly placed an old photograph on the table. It showed Mercer Point Lighthouse during a violent storm. The city never should have sold it. Eleanor frowned. "You knew what was underneath?" Samuel nodded. "I helped classify the project." Martin looked surprised. "You told everyone the network had been dismantled." Samuel's tired eyes met his. "I lied." Silence filled the room. Samuel continued. "Because after the government shut the program down, they ordered every document destroyed." Rebecca asked quietly, "Why?" Samuel answered with only one sentence. "Some secrets become more valuable after people forget they exist." Eleanor leaned forward. "Does Daniel Mercer know?" Samuel looked toward the harbor outside the window. "If he's his father's son, he knows enough to become very dangerous." Back beneath the lighthouse, Daniel searched the remaining cabinets. Most contained maintenance tools, old radio parts, weather instruments. Then, inside the final drawer, he found a small brass box. It was locked. Unlike everything else, carried no label, only one engraved symbol. A lighthouse, surrounded by 7 stars. The exact same symbol appeared on the first page of his father's notebook. Daniel carefully turned the box over. Something rattled inside. Not metal, paper. Before he could examine it further, a loud sound echoed from above. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Someone had entered the lighthouse. Daniel immediately switched off his flashlight. The underground chamber disappeared into complete darkness. Then, a man's voice echoed faintly through the tunnel. "Search every room. He has to be here." Daniel held his breath. Someone wasn't looking for the lighthouse anymore. They were looking for him. The footsteps grew louder. One pair, then another. Daniel remained perfectly still beneath the hidden chamber, one hand gripping the brass box while the other covered his flashlight. Dust drifted slowly through the darkness. Above him, a man's voice echoed inside the lighthouse. "Split up. Search every floor. If Mercer found the chamber, we can't let him leave with anything." Daniel's heart pounded. They weren't after the lighthouse anymore. They were after the truth. 5 minutes later, the voices faded toward the upper lantern room. Daniel quietly climbed the iron ladder. Every step had to be silent. He carefully pushed open the hidden hatch. The lighthouse was empty. The men had already left. Only muddy boot prints remained across the stone floor. Daniel looked toward the parking area. A black SUV disappeared around the coastal road. He memorized the license plate. He didn't know it yet, but that single number would destroy a billion-dollar conspiracy. That evening, Daniel finally opened the brass box. Inside were only 3 things: an old brass key, a faded photograph, and one sealed envelope marked, To the next keeper of the light. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. His father's handwriting filled the page. Daniel, if this letter reaches you, it means someone has finally come looking for what was hidden beneath the lighthouse. They will tell you this place has no value. Don't believe them. The emergency navigation system below wasn't built to make money. It was built because ships deserve one final light when every other system fails. Daniel continued reading. Then his breathing stopped. The final paragraph explained everything. 20 years earlier, the government had planned to shut down every manual emergency navigation station. Thomas Mercer had objected. He warned them that satellites, radar, and digital systems could all fail together during severe magnetic storms. Nobody listened. The system was buried. The records were erased. The lighthouse was forgotten. Except, Thomas secretly removed one critical component before the shutdown: the crystal lens regulator. Without it, no one could ever activate the emergency beacon. Daniel looked around the cottage. If his father hadn't left it underground, then where was it? His eyes slowly moved toward the old brass compass lying beside the notebook. For the first time, he noticed the compass was unusually heavy. He turned it over. A tiny engraving read, "The light always points home." Daniel twisted the outer ring. A hidden compartment clicked open. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, rested a crystal no larger than a golf ball. It shimmered with an unusual blue light. His father had hidden the missing regulator inside the family compass all along. 3 days later, the storm arrived. Not an ordinary storm. The strongest coastal storm in almost 30 years. Rain hammered the harbor. Wind bent steel cranes. Power failed across half the coastline. Then, exactly as Thomas Mercer had predicted decades earlier, a powerful solar disturbance knocked out satellite navigation. Every modern guidance system went dark. Cargo ships began drifting toward the rocky reefs. Emergency radios filled with desperate voices. Inside Graves' maritime headquarters, engineers shouted over one another. "GPS is gone. Radar isn't responding. We've lost visual tracking." Eleanor Graves stood frozen. Then Captain Lawson spoke quietly. "There is still one light." Every eye turned toward him. The lighthouse. Eleanor didn't hesitate this time. "Find Daniel Mercer." Daniel was already climbing the lighthouse. Sophie followed close behind, carrying the old compass. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Underground, Daniel installed the crystal regulator into the emergency control panel. Nothing happened. Then, he remembered his father's final words. "The light doesn't answer power. It answers purpose." He pulled the massive brass switch. For one long second, nothing. Then the ancient generators roared to life. The tower shook. Dust filled the chamber. Above them, after 20 silent years, the great Fresnel lens slowly began to rotate. A brilliant white beam burst across the storm. It sliced through rain, fog, and darkness like daylight itself. Out at sea, captains who had already accepted they might lose their ships suddenly saw it. The Mercer light. Follow the beam. One by one, 63 cargo vessels changed course. 3 Coast Guard cutters guided trapped ferries to safety. More than 800 passengers reached the harbor unharmed. Not a single life was lost. The next morning, news helicopters circled the lighthouse. Television crews crowded the cliffs. Reporters called Daniel a hero. Eleanor Graves arrived without cameras. She walked alone. When Daniel stepped outside, she quietly held out the original lighthouse deed. "I was wrong. I judged the building because I judged the man." Daniel smiled gently. "It happens." She looked toward the lighthouse. "Name your price." Daniel shook his head. "I don't want your money." "What do you want?" He looked at Sophie, then toward the sea. "I want one promise. No company will ever be allowed to erase history simply because technology becomes newer." Weeks later, Mercer Point Lighthouse became a protected National Historic Landmark. The underground emergency navigation system was restored. Every new harbor captain learned Thomas Mercer's story. At the entrance stood a bronze plaque. It didn't mention billion-dollar companies. It didn't mention famous CEOs. Simply read, "When every modern system failed, one forgotten light brought everyone home." And every evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the Atlantic, Daniel and Sophie still sat on the same cliff, watching the old lighthouse shine once again. Not because the world needed to remember the tower, but because the world should never again forget the people who quietly kept the light alive.